Do you ever feel like you just don't have the time to sit down and read the news every morning? Sometimes things get so hectic you can't even scroll through your feeds while you're trying to get ready. A new podcast from Boise State Public Radio has you covered. I'm George Prentice, and I want to invite you to check out The Connector every weekday morning. You can get up to speed on all of the Idaho news you need to start your day without ever interrupting your morning routine. All you have to do is hit play. That's The Connector from Boise State Public Radio. Find it wherever you get your podcasts.
From the studios of Boise State Public Radio News, I'm Samantha Wright, filling in for Jim and Gaudette. It's Idaho Matters, and it's Friday. Time for our Reporter Roundtable, when we get you up to date on all the news that made headlines this past week. Our panel today includes Kyle Fahnenstiel, reporter for the Idaho Capital Sun, Ruth Brown with Idaho Reports on Idaho Public Television, Sarah Cutler, reporter with the Idaho Statesman, and we're going to start today with Associated Press correspondent Rebecca Boone. Hi, Rebecca. How you doing?
Good. Thanks for having me.
Okay. Yesterday, the Trump administration dropped a Biden administration lawsuit against Idaho's abortion law, and that move was telegraphed on Tuesday in your AP story that said it was coming. So give us a little background. What was the lawsuit trying to do?
Well, Idaho's abortion ban makes it illegal to perform an abortion unless it is done to prevent the death of the pregnant patient. The Department of Justice under the Biden administration said that runs counter to a federal law called EMTALA, for the Emergency Medical Treatment and Active Labor Act. That's because EMTALA requires any emergency room that gets Medicare funding, which is nearly all of them, to stabilize patients that are experiencing medical emergencies that threaten their life or their health. So the DOJ said that stabilizing care includes emergency abortions if the abortion is treatment for that medical emergency. Now, that's rare, but it does happen. About 50,000 people in the U.S. develop life-threatening complications each year, including blood loss or the loss of reproductive organs or sepsis. And in some of those cases, doctors might need to terminate a pregnancy to protect the health of the pregnant person. But attorneys representing Idaho have maintained on the other side that the ban allows doctors to protect both the pregnant mother and the fetus. And in fact, earlier this week, Idaho Deputy Attorney General Brian Turch told U.S. District Judge Belin Windmill that there is no medical situation in which it's necessary to do an abortion as part of stabilizing care.
And this is something that we've talked about a bit on the show, and you reported this too, that some Idaho doctors said that pregnant women were seeing delays in care because of this concern over emergency treatment, or they were being flown out of state to get treatment because doctors were afraid to skirt into the Idaho law. Tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. So enforcement of the abortion ban in these emergency rooms has been blocked for most of the past 2 years since it was enacted. But there was a 4-month period where the U.S. Supreme Court allowed that ban to go into effect. And St. Luke's health system said it airlifted 6 pregnant patients out of state to treat medical emergencies during that period. In some of those cases, the patient was moved because doctors felt there was a possibility that their condition could worsen to the point that an abortion would be needed to protect their health or life. And they feared that at that point, they would be too sick to be transferred. Doctors at other hospitals have also reported pregnant patients facing these delays in care, sometimes because doctors weren't sure under the ban whether a patient's condition was bad enough to actually be threatening their life rather than their health. And so sometimes that meant that they had to wait to consult with other physicians or even the hospital's legal team, their attorneys, and pulling those people in to consult during a medical emergency at 3 a.m. in the morning can be tough to do.
Wow. Okay. And we've been following this EMTALA case for a while. And now that the federal lawsuit has been dropped, our reporter, Julie Luquetta, reported St. Luke's brought a similar suit against Idaho's attorney general this week, right after the federal suit was dropped. So it sounds like this isn't the end of a fight against Idaho's abortion ban?
That's right. St. Luke's actually filed a lawsuit in January because their officials anticipated that since the Ninth U.S. Circuit hadn't yet ruled on that EMTALA case, that the Trump administration might make this move to drop it. So in many ways, it's kind of like a plaintiff swap, with St. Luke's stepping in as the DOJ steps out. St. Luke's lawsuit is a separate lawsuit, but Judge Windmill indicated this week that he wanted attorneys on both sides to go through those filings and stipulations and exhibits that were part of the EMTALA case and decide which ones they wanted to bring into the St. Luke's lawsuit, since they are clearly relevant.
Wow. Okay. And there is concern, I understand, among abortion rights advocates that Trump's decision in Idaho could be an indicator in another long-standing legal battle that's been going on. Is that true? You reported on this too, I think.
Yeah, so this concern is that whether the Trump decision to drop the Idaho case is a sign that the administration could also reverse course on a legal battle involving telehealth access to mifepristone. Mifepristone is the medication that's used in the most common abortion method, which is a two-drug method. And under the Biden administration, the Department of Justice had sought to dismiss a complaint brought by a handful of states who were seeking to roll back access to mifepristone. Last summer, the Supreme Court unanimously agreed to keep the federal changes that eased that access. But then last fall, Idaho, Kansas, and Missouri renewed their push to restrict mifepristone. Now, that case is being handled in the Northern District of Texas in federal court. And Department of Justice attorneys representing the FDA filed a motion to dismiss the lawsuit on January 18th, and that was just 2 days before Trump took office. Now, Marty Makary is Trump's pick to lead the FDA, and this week he told a congressional committee that he had no, quote, preconceived plans, unquote, on medication abortion policy.
Wow, it sounds like, and there are so many cases. We were talking about this before the show. There are just so many cases, lawsuits that are out there, and reporters and others are trying to navigate all those. And now with the new administration in place, it's unclear where some of these might go.
Yeah, and we see that in a lot of areas of law, where like water law is a good example, right? One administration will do something regarding water law, and then the next administration will reverse it or switch it up. But in this post Roe versus Wade, Dodd's decision world, abortion access or reproductive health care issues are really something that everybody is watching closely.
Absolutely. Well, great reporting. We're going to link back to it. And thanks, Rebecca, for giving us a quick update.
Thanks for having me.
We're continuing our Reporter Roundtable. Reporters today include Kyle Fahnenstiel with Idaho Capital Sun, Ruth Brown with Idaho Reports on Idaho Public Television, and Sarah Cutler with the Idaho Statesman. Okay, Kyle and Sarah, you're up first. There's been a lot of talk about a bill to put guardrails on Idaho's Medicaid expansion program. GOP lawmakers had one bill, it stalled in the Senate. A new bill passed in the House, I think it was yesterday, and all the Republicans in the House voted for it. So let's drill down. Kyle, what will this newer bill actually do?
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Samantha. So this is a longer, complicated bill that does a lot, but at a high level, it's proposing a bunch of big changes to Medicaid policy to try to save on costs. The biggest and most controversial policy in the bill is Medicaid work requirements. Idaho's tried this before. They didn't get federal approval for it, but they're trying again with the bill directs the health department to submit to a new waiver. So if Idaho does get federal approval, able-bodied adults on Idaho Medicaid would be required to work and to prove that to state health officials to be able to still stay on Medicaid. But there's a ton of other changes in the bill. It would also start the process of shifting Idaho Medicaid benefits to being managed by a private company. That's usually called managed care, and that's used by a ton of states for Medicaid. And it also has kind of an interesting trigger provision. So Idaho Republican lawmakers have worried for a really long time what happens if the federal government stops paying for the vast majority of Medicaid expansion. They pay for about 90% right now, the federal government does. If that happens, this bill would set up a trigger that lets the Idaho Department of Health and Welfare director make pretty broad cuts to Medicaid.
And Sarah, I liked how you explained Medicaid expansion in your coverage this week. Remind us just who gets health coverage from expansion, because we talk about Medicaid, but it's different from the rest of Idaho's Medicaid program, and that can be confusing.
Yeah, absolutely. So basically, the Medicaid expansion program is for people who are in what is sometimes called the coverage gap for Medicaid. So that's people who earn too much to qualify for the regular program, but not quite enough to qualify for private insurance discounts. And I think the Idaho Department of Health and Welfare has said there are about 90,000 Idahoans in that gap.
Wow. Okay. So we're talking about a lot of people. Kyle, you mentioned the work reporting requirements in this newer bill, and there was some pushback about that because some people were worried that it might be too much red tape. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so most people on Medicaid are already working. It's about 50-50 in Idaho. It kind of fluctuates day by day. You can find these numbers on the Department of Health and Welfare's website. Um, and a lot of advocates say that these Medicaid work requirements are basically just going to be putting administrative barriers to getting access to the program. Experience in some other states that did work requirements suggests that people had trouble proving that they were actually working to state health officials, even though most of them were. So some people who were working lost their Medicaid coverage. And in other states that did do Medicaid work requirements, it wasn't cheap. Georgia, right now, they're the only state that still has Medicaid work requirements. This big ProPublica investigation found that Georgia's work requirements has cost taxpayers almost $87 million.
That's a lot of money. Sarah, you had a quote from Caldwell Representative Lucas Kaler about how people on Medicaid expansion owed accountability to the program. What else did he say?
Yeah, as Kyle mentioned, there's a lot of concerns that it may be quite onerous both for the people on this program and for the state to implement some of these requirements. But Representative Kaler was kind of pushing back on that idea and arguing that, if you're going to receive this money from the state, there should be some accountability there. This isn't, basically free money. This is other taxpayers who themselves might be struggling to make ends meet in a time of a lot of inflation and high costs. So he kind of made this case that, those taxpayers who may be helping to subsidize this care are owed, that kind of reporting and accountability.
Kyle, the bill passed the House this week. All the GOP lawmakers voted for it. Where does it go now? Does it have to go to the Senate?
Yeah, so this just passed the House this week. It still has to go up in the Senate where it get a committee hearing and be up for a floor vote. It's not likely that this one is going to stall the other Medicaid bill that stalled this year. Most people thought it was probably going to repeal Medicaid expansion because it required a bunch of policy changes that were unlikely to get federal approval. This new bill, the Medicaid cost control bill, doesn't threaten to repeal expansion, and it's also co-sponsored by the Senate Health and Welfare Committee chairwoman, Senator Julie Van Orden. She was the one who stopped that other bill from advancing.
So now we wait and see what the Senate does. Okay, Kyle and Ruth, I want to turn to a bill that would make a firing squad the main execution method for Idaho death row inmates. Kyle, tell us what this bill would do.
Yeah, so right now the firing squad is allowed through a 2023 law that the legislature passed as a backup option for the death penalty in Idaho behind lethal injection. But this bill, if it becomes law, would make the firing squad the primary death penalty method in Idaho, and Idaho would be the only state to do that. Only 5 other states allow firing squads for execution, but none of those other states have the firing squad as their main method.
Ruth, you're going to talk about this tonight on Idaho Reports. What are you focusing on? What are you hearing?
Thanks, Samantha. The firing squad is new to Idaho. Well, it's coming back. Historically, it has been used, but I would say in recent history, it is new. We will talk briefly about the pros and cons in the Senate debate. I think most of the individuals who supported it are of the mindset that the death penalty is the law of the land in Idaho, and we need a method to carry that out. It is getting harder and harder to obtain chemicals to carry out a lethal injection. And of course, in about in February of last year, they had a failed execution that was the attempted execution of Thomas Creech. The medical staff failed to establish an IV line that they thought would be solid enough to carry out the amount of chemicals needed. So they are looking for a secondary option because, I mean, they want to be able to kill this man as well as the other individuals on death row. So we'll talk about that. The debate in the Senate was interesting because there are a lot of folks that are just, they believe in the death penalty as a method of punishment. But we also heard from Senator Dan Foreman, who is the only Republican to side with the Democrats in voting against this. Dan Foreman is a retired law enforcement officer, and he has spoken openly about how he has seen individuals die by gunshot wound, and he does not believe it is a humane method of execution. He called it brutal, he called it cruel and inhumane. And in committee, he used the term, he said he thinks it's beneath the dignity of Idaho. As a longtime court reporter, I think there's also some current concern around how exactly it would be carried out. The death should the governor sign it. As of today, the governor has not signed the bill, but should the death penalty be carried out by a firing squad, the details, the logistics of that would be left to the director of the Idaho Department of Correction, who is currently Josh T. Waltz. But keep in mind, if we put this in statute, Josh T. Waltz not going to live for forever. So it would be left to whoever is the Department of Corrections director. We have not seen that policy. Representatives have said in committee that IDOC has told them that they plan to use a mechanized version of the firing squad rather than maybe what folks think of as individuals standing with rifles. But again, I don't know that for sure because the standard operating procedure has not been released. And IDOC did not testify at any of these hearings. And so I think there are some questions that remain, but I'll be keeping an eye on the governor's website to see if he signs it. I strongly suspect he will. I have no reason to believe he will not.
All right. We'll keep an eye on it. Governor Brad Little signed the mask mandate bill, and we'll get into a lot of this on Wednesday during our Dr. Roundtable, so tune in for that. But I do want to touch on what happened this week. Sarah, what is the bill and what would it do?
Yeah, so basically this bill blocks local jurisdictions like cities and counties from requiring people to wear a face mask or a face shield in general, but including in a future pandemic. And I think it's worth noting that during COVID, Idaho never had a statewide mask mandate or requirement.
Kyle, you mentioned in your story on this that there were some exceptions in the bill for folks. What were they?
Yeah, so for the most part, the exceptions are for certain job settings where masks are needed as part of the job. So things like healthcare, industrial environments like welding or working with dangerous materials.
And we're going to have more on this one on Wednesday, so tune in at noon on the Dr. Roundtable for that. Ruth, tell me about ABLE accounts, ABLE, ABLE. I was not aware of these. How do these work? Apparently, this is something that's going through the legislature right now.
Yeah, it actually passed the Senate on Wednesday, and so that'll head to the governor's desk. ABLE is an acronym for Achieving a Better Life Experience, and it passed with 27-6 vote. This will allow people who have a disability and are collecting Social Security income to save money. currently, an individual who is collecting SSI cannot have more than $2,000 in their bank account because it could potentially jeopardize them from no longer being able to collect SSI. And just for clarity, these are folks that are truly disabled, that they collect SSI and Medicaid, or they've been diagnosed with their disability prior to the age of 26. And so the bill passed, and it will allow them to save money for other qualifying needs, things like housing or medical expenses that aren't covered by their medical coverage. Senator Bjerke, he offered the example of, say, a person who uses a wheelchair is unable to fix their wheelchair accessible vehicle to go to work. That then makes that person no longer able to work. And these are things that folks without disabilities don't often think of, but the goal is to allow them to save some money for these kinds of things, or just save money like you or I might, and provide greater independence. So that heads to the governor's desk. I haven't seen if he's signed it yet, but I have no reason to believe he won't.
Ruth, I was really amazed in this story, and I think this goes to what you said about, most people don't even know this. People with disabilities on Social Security can't have more than $2,000 in their bank accounts, or they lose their Social Security.
Correct. You would no longer meet the qualification for a person of the indigency level that needs to that you need to be at to collect SSI. And it varies if you have SSI with disability, but yeah, $2,000 is the cutoff. And so I think people in the disability community are aware of that and concerned, and it's something to keep an eye on. And it really puts restraints on them for being able to just save money for any kind of need they might have.
Absolutely. Fascinating story, and we'll wait and see if the governor signs it. Sarah, you had a very comprehensive story on a bill that would cut child care regulations in the state. Tell me about this bill. What does it do?
Yeah, well, so first of all, this bill is responding to something that it seems like pretty much everyone agrees is a problem, not just in Idaho, but pretty much nationwide, which is a lack of childcare. What we do have tends to be unaffordable for parents, or very difficult to afford. And yet at the same time, a lot of workers in the industry are really underpaid, spread very thin, and burnt out. So broadly speaking, this bill aims to address that problem by cutting back on some of the regulations around how childcares and daycares in Idaho are run. In particular, an area of a lot of focus, especially in the conversation, was about pulling back on the required ratios between providers or staff members and children. Right now, there are required specific numbers for those for different age groups, and this bill would pull those numbers back and basically allow each childcare to determine what number would be appropriate or what ratio would be appropriate for them. And I should say also that the bill also, I think, blocks local jurisdictions like cities from enforcing requirements that go over and above what the state requires. So right now there are, I believe, 9 cities in Idaho, including Boise, that have, kind of extra regulations on top of state requirements, and this would block that.
Well, I remember we've done some reporting on Boise's regulations and some of what they did, but I want to check on one thing. So it would not have a cap on the number of children to provider. So in theory, you could have one person running the daycare and like 30 kids in there.
In theory, yes.
Okay. Why do supporters say we need to cut the regulations? Is this to get more childcares up and running?
Yeah, exactly. So I think that there was a sense from the sponsors and supporters that overly onerous regulations are keeping people from starting up new childcares or, impeding the number of kids who could be in a childcare and just generally affecting availability. There was a sense also supporters were saying, we've tried other things. We've tried federal and state government subsidies for childcare, and it's not working. Prices keep going up. It's not solving the problem. So I think there was a sense of let's give this a shot. I think regulation is the problem. We need to pull that back. One of the sponsors did speak anecdotally about his own experience of being raised in a daycare that sounded, a bit more informal. It was a mother who was also watching other neighbors' children, and it seemed like this was the kind of thing he was hoping to enable, these more informal, perhaps in-home daycares. One other point to your question about, how many kids per providers we might see, sponsors and supporters generally said they had the sense that the free market could kind of sort out this problem. So if a parent was considering a certain childcare center for their kid and they walked in and saw there were 12 babies and only one provider, that the parent wouldn't choose that childcare. So they kind of hoped that these concerns around numbers would sort themselves out.
And you also heard from folks or saw folks who were against this bill. What are they saying? What are their concerns?
Yeah, well, first off here, I would say that I think the numbers are worth highlighting. In this public hearing yesterday, there were 38 people signed up in opposition to the bill. Not all of them had time to testify. And then there were 2 people who testified in favor. And I know there were similar proportions at this bill's previous public hearing over on the House side. And the types of people testifying ranged from local government officials, childcare providers, even family members of children who had died in childcare centers
Yep.
that weren't managed properly. And so all of these people, they had a range of concerns, but in general, I think people focused on that ratio issue that I mentioned, and there was a sense that this is not going to be safe for kids, and that, just given the incentives of trying to run a center and make it be profitable, there would be an incentive to really push the ratios, as one person put it. That centers might just see how thin they could spread their staff, and that would be at risk, of course, for the kids' safety. One other note too is, and I think a representative from Boise made this point in the hearing, is that Boise does have some of those higher levels of safety regulations, as I mentioned, but Boise has actually worked to cut regulation and red tape in other areas, such as streamlining the licensing process or adjusting its city code to enable there to be more in-home childcares. So they were trying to, address that regulation concern, but from another angle. Finally, I would just say, I think there was a pervasive sense that this bill was kind of experimental. Like, we don't really know if regulations are the problem here. We're just seeing if this works, and it's a really big risk for these kids' safety. There was one advocate who, in her testimony, basically asked the legislature to, instead of passing this bill, to form a task force to look at the full picture of childcare shortages and maybe come back in the future in a year with a more comprehensive set of informed suggestions.
And you touched on this. The shortages. It's amazing. It's really, really, really hard for parents who need childcare to find childcare. It's just there are just not enough childcare facilities out there.
Exactly. Yeah, I think it's been, this is something I had looked at about a year ago, and I think it's just been a pervasive problem. Both, I spoke last year with providers themselves who were talking about their incredibly quickly rising costs, everything from insurance to food, and at the same time, the prices they would need to charge parents to keep up with that, would put the childcare out of reach for a lot of families. So everyone feels like they're in a bind.
So where is the bill now? What's the next step?
Yeah, so, I mentioned that there was pretty overwhelming testimony against this bill, both in the House committee and yesterday in the Senate committee. But nonetheless, it did move forward. The committee voted to send it on to the Senate floor for a full hearing. Because it's already passed the House, if it passes the Senate, it will go on to the governor's desk.
Okay. Kyle, tell us about this bill that would not allow you to buy candy or soda with food stamps. I think this is a fascinating debate. First, tell me what the bill does.
Well, that's basically what the bill would do. The change would just be for Idaho, but Idaho does need federal approval from the USDA to do that because this program, it's formally called SNAP, or the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. It's run by the federal government.
Gotcha. And So herein lies the debate, I think. How does the bill define candy? And why do some people not like the definition?
Yeah, so like many bills, the definition is the sticking point here. Most of the pushback around the bill so far has been around the pretty broad definition of candy. Critics say it's also going to ban Snap from covering granola bars and power bars. And they also say this definition is going to be hard, and this kind of requirement on grocery stores is going to be hard for grocery stores to work around. So some stores might just stop accepting Snap. So under the bill, candy would be, quote, a preparation of sugar, honey, or other natural or artificial sweeteners combined with chocolate, fruit, nuts, or other ingredients or flavorings in certain forms.
Well, and I think this is fascinating. I think you talked about, well, what's the difference? The bill wouldn't make a distinction between like a granola bar and a Twix. I got to say though, I have looked at some granola bars on the market that are worse for you than a Snickers. So I could see where this argument over, how do you define this can be tricky, and how to pin it down, because there's a lot of candy out there, a lot of granola bars out there, and other things that may not fall into that category.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard a lot of concern over the definition. I don't know how you would change it. I think I haven't seen much talk about changing the definition, and I also haven't seen a ton of discussion about the definition of soda. Representative Jordan Redmond, he's the one who's sponsoring this bill. He says that soda is the number one commodity being spent on SNAP, but the bill's soda definition seems to be pretty broad too. So soda under the bill would be beverages that have sweeteners, natural or artificial, and drinks wouldn't be considered soda if they're, of course, alcoholic, more than 50% juice, they have some sort of milk, or if they require some sort of preparation like a powder or a concentrate.
Again, fascinating debate. Where is this bill, and is the federal government looking at this sort of thing as well?
Yeah, so this bill passed the House on a narrow vote this week, so it still needs to go to the Senate and pass the Senate and avoid the governor's veto to become law. It could go up for a Senate committee hearing any day now. I don't know the specifics on when it might go up. And it does sound like the federal government is looking at this. Representative Lana Rebel, she's the Idaho House Democrat leader, mentioned the Healthy Snap Act that's being considered in Congress right now. I don't know the specifics of that bill. And then again, Representative Redmond, who's sponsoring this bill, has repeatedly called the bill part of the Make America Healthy Again movement. That's being promoted by the current U.S. Health Secretary, Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
All right, we'll keep an eye on it. Before we get to Kyle has another story. This is on a fascinating thing. It's property insurance in Idaho and wildfires. I want to ask both of you, Kyle and Sarah, since you've both been covering the legislature quite a bit, and we've talked about a few bills that have gone through, either been signed by the governor or are waiting to be signed by the governor, and we're sort of getting into the time where lawmakers are getting ready to go home, maybe. So I want to ask both of you, what bills are you watching right now that are important bills that you're keeping track of and that your readers are keeping track of? And since I am putting you both on the spot, I will start with you, Sarah.
Actually, I was going to say, Kyle, why don't you take that one first if it's okay? I'm going to give it some thought for a moment.
Kyle, you're up first then.
Yeah, honestly, Medicaid is the big thing I'm watching. I've covered Medicaid expansion for years. I covered the signature push for the ballot initiative in 2018. This is my third legislative session. I went and did some other stuff in between, but I've heard Idaho Republican lawmakers complain for years and years about how expensive this program is, Medicaid overall and Medicaid expansion. And I heard a lot of talk before the session started that this might be the year something finally changes with Medicaid. There's been a lot of talk about trying to control Medicaid's costs, and not a lot has been changed in it. There've been proposals to repeal expansion in previous years. There was one proposal that would have likely repealed expansion this year that looks like it's stalled. But of course, bills aren't failed until the session is over. I was hearing over and over that this might be the year that something changes with Medicaid, and it sounds like it is. This Medicaid expansion or this Medicaid cost control bill would represent some pretty big shifts in Medicaid. I'm really interested in what the process going forward is going to look like for rolling out managed care. I've covered a lot of the state's managed care contracts and a lot of issues with how the state's been able to their process to award contracts for several different really expensive policies, and also to be able to oversee that those contractors are actually doing what they're required to do. So I'm very invested in understanding what happens here, and I'm very interested in covering how these policies actually get rolled out after the session as well.
Well, and that was what I was going to ask, because even if we do pass this bill this time, a lot of the things in the bill, like work requirements and some of the other things, require waivers from the federal government. So even if the bill were to pass and be signed and go into law, whether immediately or July 1st, a lot of what would be in the bill wouldn't happen right away because the federal government has to sign off on it. Am I reading that right?
Yeah, a lot of this, if you're going to go to managed care, that's a waiver that CMS has to approve. Of course, I think the last number I saw was like 40 states use comprehensive managed care, and Idaho does have some managed care, like in behavioral health contracts, for Medicaid and other parts of Medicaid. But a lot of it is, a lot of the traditional Medicaid benefits, like actually approving benefits are done by the health department. So instead of that, it's going to be a private company doing it. And I'm very interested in understanding kind of the fine details of how this rolls out, how providers are impacted, how patients are impacted. Does this actually save costs? I followed the legislature had an interim committee on managed care. I think it was in 2023. And they heard a lot of mixed evidence whether managed care actually saves money. But I think the big pitch that I heard for managed care there was that managed care can create a more cost control, a more predictable budget, because these companies are the ones that are required to try to make sure that they account for what these costs are going to be, and they keep costs at a predictable level. So I think that's where it'll go to. And I've covered a lot of issues in our behavioral health contract. I heard from so many providers that Idaho's Medicaid contractor for mental health, Magellan, was being delayed in sending payments to providers, and so I think there's a lot of like fine detail to these policies that'll be really interesting to understand how they roll out.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Sarah, what are you watching? What's your number one or two bills that you're keeping an eye on?
Yeah, I was going to say both in terms of the bills and also potentially kind of a broader theme that I'm watching. It's been really interesting to watch some of these tax cut bills move through. But I think partially for me, it's of course has financial significance for Idahoans, but it's been really interesting to watch the dynamic between Governor Little and the legislature this year. Of course, as has been discussed a lot, Governor Little had voiced his preferences for a lot of these things. Including, flagging for Idahoans that we may see some serious changes and cuts to federal money flowing into the state, that we needed to be nimble and kind of, flexible financially and have our coffers relatively full. And so I think it's been interesting to watch the power dynamics as the legislature, goes far above and beyond kind of what the governor had asked for. So I think both on bills relating to tax cuts and also on some of these other bills we've seen around emergency, the executive branch's powers in emergencies, how much power they have, the legislature, I think, trying to make some efforts to take some of that power back. So that's, I think, it's not confined to a specific bill necessarily, but that's a dynamic that I've been watching.
And Sarah, I've loved your reporting on what's been going on. Whether it's filling up rooms, hearing rooms, or reactions. It's really good to get that on the spot, on the scene kind of idea of what's been happening. Kyle, we've got about 2.5, maybe 3 minutes left. Tell me about this property insurance bill. This was actually called for a committee. What is it? What's going on?
Yeah, so last year, Idaho had a pretty rough wildfire season. And Idaho's top insurance regulator says that's affecting how the property insurance market is working. He says that some property insurance carriers are trying to stop offering property insurance, and some homeowners are losing their property insurance or seeing their rates shoot up a lot. And so this new resolution that the legislature introduced yesterday, it would call to create a legislative committee to study Idaho's property insurance market. And it's part of several pieces of legislation going around the state house right now to deal with this issue of wildfire's impact on the property insurance market. And I just want to say a big shout out to Murphy Woodhouse for the Mountain West News Bureau. I have really appreciated his coverage of this issue, and he's covered this issue in and out for a long time.
Murphy has done a great job on this, and all the firefighters related stories. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Kyle, but a lot of this is coming out of, especially what happened with the LA fires, and some insurance companies, even before the LA fires, who were raising insurance or trying to raise insurance costs in California, or dropping coverage in places like California. And we've got a lot of places in Idaho in rural Idaho, that are in that wildland urban interface that the insurance companies are worried about.
Yeah, but Idaho's Department of Insurance Director, Dean Cameron, he says it's not just folks in the wildland urban interface or folks who live in rural Idaho who are getting impacted by property insurance changes. He says residents all over the state are seeing insurance rates be changed, and they're seeing the effect of wildfire's impact of property insurance on the property insurance market.
Fascinating. Well, this has been great. You guys have had some great stories this week. I want to thank you for coming on the show, for sharing them. We're going to link back to them. And thanks for spending some time with us.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, Samantha.
We've been speaking with Kyle Steele. He's the reporter for the Idaho Capital Sun. Ruth Brown with Idaho Reports on Idaho Public Television, which airs tonight. Sarah Cutler, reporter with the Idaho Statesman, and Associated Press reporter Rebecca Boone, who joined us earlier in the show.
This is the Idaho Matters podcast. I'm Gemma Gaudet.